Is Bulgaria turning towards Russia? Since the start of the Ukraine war, worries about European Union have grown as Hungary and Slovakia have edged closer to Moscow. Now, some fear that Bulgaria could follow. A rising far-right, public discontent over European integration and deep-rooted residual pro-Russian sentiment raise questions about whether Sofia might also break ranks with its EU partners and NATO allies. But while many may see this as a real risk, others are unconvinced. So, what lies behind Bulgaria-Russia relations, and is Sofia really edging closer to Moscow? Hello and welcome. I'm James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict and security. History often plays a significant role in international relations. Past friendships and enmities can have profound impacts on the way that countries interact today. But while we often think of states as generally being either allies or opponents, in some cases a rather more complex picture emerges. Countries can hover between the two positions, oscillating between times of close relations and periods of profound tension. The relationship between Bulgaria and Russia is a textbook case in point. Over the past 150 years, Moscow has been a liberator, ally, opponent, and even an overseer. But while Bulgaria moved inexorably towards the West since the end of the Cold War, joining NATO and the European Union, many Bulgarians still feel a pull towards Russia. This potent and often contradictory relationship has been brought to the fore by the Ukraine war. By way of context, the Republic of Bulgaria is in southeast Europe. Sitting on the eastern edge of the Balkans, it's bordered by Romania to the north, Serbia and North Macedonia to the west, and Greece and Turkey to the south. To its east is the Black Sea. The population is currently around 6.4 million. But while most citizens are ethnic Bulgarians speaking a Slavic language and practicing Orthodox Christianity, the country is also home to significant minorities. This includes a large Bulgarian Turkish Muslim community. Bulgaria has an exceptionally long history. Having been part of the Roman Empire, during the Middle Ages, various Bulgarian states rose and fell until the late 14th century, when the country was conquered by the Ottoman Empire. But while Bulgaria remained under Turkish rule for the next 5 centuries, by the 19th century things were changing. As nationalism grew in Europe, pressure grew for Bulgarian independence. And it's here that Russia enters the story. Having emerged as a champion of the Orthodox Christian peoples of the Balkans, helping both Serbia and Greece emerge as independent states, Russia's attention turned to Bulgaria. Having won a victory against the Ottoman Empire in 1878, Russia now forced Istanbul to give up Bulgaria. But while the Treaty of San Stefano initially envisaged a large Bulgaria, this was later cut back. Instead, the new principality was smaller than many hoped, leaving many Bulgarians outside its borders, a grievance that would drive Sofia's policy for decades afterwards. But while it may have seemed as though relations with Imperial Russia would be exceptionally strong, tensions soon emerged. Bulgaria's regional ambitions, coupled with great power rivalries, put it at odds with its liberator. Having lost territory to its neighbours during the Balkan Wars, during the First World War, Bulgaria joined the Central Powers of Germany and Austro-Hungary against Serbia and the Entente, including Russia. However, the gamble failed. When the Central Powers, including Bulgaria, were defeated, the country's losses were cemented. But despite this, Sofia kept pushing to revise the borders. As a result, when the Second World War began, it allied with Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But once Berlin and Moscow turned on each other, Bulgaria was trapped. In September 1944, the Red Army entered the country, and as the monarchy fell, Bulgaria, along with most of Eastern Europe, became part of the new Soviet sphere during the Cold War, thus signalling the start of 4 decades of Russian-led communist control over the country. Although Bulgaria had been invaded and occupied by Soviet forces, it would go on to forge exceptionally close ties with the USSR. In fact, its relationship was far closer than any of the other satellite states of the Warsaw Pact. Lining up behind Moscow under Todor Zhivkov, Bulgaria's long-standing dictator, Sofia even floated the idea of becoming the USSR's 16th Republic in the early 1960s. But while this eventually came to nothing, the two countries nevertheless retained extremely close relations. As well as defence and intelligence links, there were also powerful cultural ties, as Russian even became a mandatory subject in the country's schools. But all this would change with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. But while Sofia and Moscow appeared to want to retain good relations and even signed a friendship treaty, and Bulgaria remained dependent on Russian energy, the country's strategic drift was now steadily westward. In 2004, it joined NATO, and 3 years later, in January 2007, it joined the European Union. But while many Bulgarians continued to hold pro-Russian views, over the years that followed, many of the remaining political and economic links were finally cut. For example, in 2014, and much to Moscow's anger, plans for a major new international pipeline that would cross Bulgaria into the Balkans collapsed amidst growing EU-Russia tensions over Ukraine. But the biggest shift came after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. At first, Sofia was hesitant about taking a strong line against Russia. While it supported Ukraine with Soviet-standard munitions, it didn't condemn Moscow as openly as many other EU states. However, this all changed following a series of spy scandals. In June 2022, Sofia expelled 70 Russian diplomats, and the following year it expelled the head of the Russian Orthodox Church in Sofia for advancing Russian state interests. From there, Bulgaria became steadily more pro-Ukrainian and anti-Russian. In December 2023, the parliament approved more military aid to Kyiv, and in March 2024, Bulgaria ended processing Russian crude oil. While all this would seem to show that Bulgaria is now firmly aligned with the West, the picture isn't quite as straightforward as it may seem. There are, in fact, some deep and important cracks emerging. For a start, the country's President Rumen Radev has questioned arming Ukraine and even boycotted the 2024 NATO summit over policy disagreements. Likewise, other significant voices lean towards Moscow. In January 2025, a new government took office with support from the Bulgarian Socialist Party, which has traditionally taken a pro-Russian position and has often also opposed sending weapons to Ukraine. Meanwhile, at a popular level, pro-Russian sentiment has continued in certain quarters, as EU integration has failed to deliver the economic development that many hoped. Many older Bulgarians look back to the Soviet era with nostalgia. But even amongst the young and middle-aged, there's been a pushback. And it's against this backdrop that a new far-right party has increasingly come to the fore. Revival, or Возрождение, has surged on an anti-Western platform. In addition to opposing NATO and military aid to Ukraine, it also stands against Bulgaria's forthcoming membership of the euro, the European single currency. In February 2025, thousands rallied in Sofia, chanting slogans against EU colonialism and the erosion of sovereignty. Then, in April 2025, it even signed a cooperation agreement with United Russia, the ruling political movement in the Russian Federation. I hope you're finding this useful. If so, please do consider giving it a like and perhaps subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. It all really helps. Thanks so much, and now back to the video. Seen from outside, all this suggests that Bulgaria may yet tilt back towards Russia, like Hungary and Slovakia. But is this really the case? In one sense, it's an understandable view. Aside from the pro-Russian political voices, opinion polls have shown scepticism about EU funding for arms to Ukraine. Meanwhile, public opposition to the euro, which many feel will fuel inflation, and fatigue with the Ukraine war provide fertile ground for those who oppose the EU and the United States and would like to cast Russia as a traditional friend. Add to this the efforts by Moscow to push disinformation and the fact that Russian gas still transits the country, and it becomes clear why there are fears that Russia still retains a foothold in the country, and that this in turn may see Bulgaria tilt back towards Moscow at some point. But balanced against all this, there's also a strong argument that Bulgaria isn't in fact drifting back towards Russia. Despite the position of the president and some political parties, the parliament has approved military aid for Ukraine and has also aligned with EU sanctions on Russia. Meanwhile, the government has not only ended the processing of Russian crude oil, but also squeezed Russian energy firms to the point where the biggest is preparing to leave Bulgaria. More generally, the country has clearly moved against Russian threats and has steadily increased its support to neighbouring Ukraine. More to the point, NATO and EU membership continue to be at the heart of the country's orientation. Sofia clearly wants to be aligned with the vast majority of its partners in both bodies. Even at the popular level, there's little sign that there's a widespread shift towards Moscow. While the far right's protests are undoubtedly loud, opinion polls show a far more mixed picture. While many Bulgarians oppose EU funding for arms to Ukraine and worry about the euro, support for NATO and the European Union has in fact increased. This is especially marked amongst younger urban voters. While the older generation may still harbour a nostalgia for the Soviet Union, especially after the country's difficult transition following the end of the Cold War, and the middle-aged also have their doubts about the EU, the next generation appears to have a very different outlook. So, what does all this really mean? Put in a broader historical perspective, one could argue that Bulgarian-Russian relations have in fact been a pendulum, swinging from one side to another. While Russia liberated Bulgaria from Ottoman rule, the two countries were enemies in the First World War. Then, having been invaded by the USSR during the Second World War, Bulgaria became a loyal Soviet ally until it threw itself firmly into the Western camp at the end of the Cold War by joining the European Union and NATO. In this sense, there's been a fascinating cyclical nature to Bulgarian-Russian relations. But while this supports the argument that we might in fact be in the midst of another swing, this time back towards Moscow, we need to be cautious. Certainly, the battle over the country's strategic orientation is more visible than in most EU countries, especially given Bulgaria's historical ties to Russia, and Moscow clearly sees an opportunity to increase its influence. But there's little sign to say that a full reorientation is on the horizon. While there's certainly a pro-Russian voice in the country, it's important not to overplay it, at least for now. But then again, given this complex history, there's little room for complacency. While Bulgaria may at the moment seem firmly anchored in the West, EU and NATO policymakers would do well to keep a close eye on what's happening in this Southeast European country. I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.